and I trust it will make it worth your while. All right, so I'd like first of all maybe just start off with a few thank yous. First of all, I think a big thank you to the Capital Markets Association of Zambia. You can see the backdrop in behind me there. Thanks to Nicholas and his executive for actually putting this together and bringing us all together for this conversation today. The CMAZ, or the Capital Markets Association of Zambia, is a body recognized by the Securities Act of Zambia to represent and regulate the conduct of all capital market participants in Zambia. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about them, please be sure to visit the website at www.cmaz.co.za. All right, so allow me just to kind of run you through our conversation for today, how we expect our session to flow. We start off, I think we'll start off with a brief outline. I think we'll start off with introducing the panelists in just a few minutes. So you get to know who will be speaking on the topic today. And then from there, we'll proceed into the opening remarks. So our panelists are made up of individuals from different sectors of the capital markets. So it'll be interesting to hear the opening or the initial views or perspectives on green bonds in general, as well as in Zambia, of course. Right? And then thereafter, we'll proceed to a Q&A session, which I'll lead. And also it'll be a chance for our audience to also pose questions to the panelists to discuss and give responses to. I'd like to let you know that you can actually post your questions in the chat feature throughout the presentation, although they will be reserved for the Q&A session later on in our discussion today. All right. So please do feel free to do that. And then we expect that when all is said and done, we should be done within an hour 20. I think how the conversation will flow. I imagine sometimes these things can get exciting, but we hope to wrap it up within that amount of time. So I'll quickly proceed to introduce our panelists for today. I'll start off with Mutumboi, the only lady on the panel, but clearly not very representative. We can do better, right? Right. So Mutumboi is the director of markets provision, right, at the Securities and Exchange Commission of Zambia, right? So she'll be giving us a perspective from a regulator perspective. I think she's been quite instrumental in the development of the Green Bond Framework. So we're interested to hear how the regulator views or their thoughts on this specific topic. And then our next speaker is Mr. Bruno Mweemba. He's from the BIOFIN project, supported by the UNDP, or the United Nations Development Program, right? They've been quite instrumental in providing technical and financial support in getting the framework for green bonds and guidance established in Zambia. So he'll be speaking from experience of actually getting this project started in Zambia. And finally, but definitely not the least, we'll hear from Mwila-Stanbic, who's the Vice President of that Capital Markets in Zambia. He works at Stanbic, and he'll be on the panel to give us a perspective from a market practitioner in this market. All right, and that's our panel for today. And of course, I introduced myself earlier, but in case you're just joining the call, my name is Austin Chichipa. I'm running with investment banking at Zambia National Commercial Bank here in Osaka. All right, so I think without further ado, our first, we'll start off our presentation with Mutumboi. We'll hear from Mutumboi, and then we'll start off our presentation with I think some notes from Bruno, and then Mwila, and then we'll finish off with Mutumboi, right? So not ladies first, ladies last, but because they're important, right? So I guess Bruno, I guess you could kick us off. Bruno, I think will be sharing the screen with us and running us through his quick presentation.
Okay. So good morning to everyone that's joined us on the call. Like I was introduced, my name is Bruno Mweemba. I'm the technical advisor on the BIOFIN Zambia project. So basically what I'll cover is why green bonds in Zambia, and basically what have we done so far. For your own information, the BIOFIN project is a project that is superintended by the UNDP globally. We are in over 30 countries at present, and Zambia is amongst those countries. And so some of the work that we've been doing in Zambia is some of the classical outputs that are within the BIOFIN methodology, doing the expenditure review, developing the finance plan, and the like. And as part of developing that finance plan, one of the critical aspects that we were tasked to do as BIOFIN was to try and estimate the finance needs, principally for biodiversity conservation. And the instrument that we're using was the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan to try and find the finance needs that we need to implement this green growth strategy. But what you see here, I think, on the screen is an estimation of finance needs just beyond biodiversity conservation. We've done an estimation of the finance needs across different other green growth strategies. So you're talking about the NBSAP itself. You're also talking about the National Climate Change Policy and Implementation Plan, National Policy on Wetlands. At least those are some of the green growth strategies where finance needs have actually been calculated. So what you see here is finance needs around 9.7 billion for a 10-year average, which comes to about 970 million, annual average in terms of finance needs. So this is quite a big chunk.
Like this is the simplest. If someone now wants detail.
Sorry, I think we're getting some background noise.
Yeah, like okay, these are step 1, 2. Like
I think there's a guy called Charles.
I think Charles Kalela, can you please mute your mic?
You have set up a meeting. Something summarized.
Hi, Charles. I don't know if you can hear us. You please mute your mic.
Okay, I proceed. Are we good to proceed?
I think you can go ahead. You can go ahead.
All right. So anyway, when you look at these finance needs, you actually realize that in terms of just resource mobilization for the government, these are some of the 4 instruments that the government has laid out. Of course, government's national budget being one of the principal, financing instruments for Zambia's green growth strategies. You're talking about funding from bilateral and multilateral sources, private sector, and any other alternative funding sources. But now when we look at the government's national budget, which I do present here, we've done an analysis from about 2006 to date. And what you see is that the allocation towards environmental protection has never gone above even 1.5% as a percentage of the total national budget. Last year, we actually saw that we've even come down to about 0.6. And over this period, you actually see that the allocation towards environmental protection has averaged 0.6%. Just last year, no, actually for this year, it's around 600 million, which comes to about $33 million in terms of allocation to environmental protection. Yet you saw that the finance needs are around 970 million. So we have quite a huge, finance gap. So one of the instruments that we thought we could actually introduce as BIOFIN and as part of the finance plan was the green bonds. And so you'll be asking, what are green bonds? Basically, green bonds are any other kind of bond, except the proceeds for such bonds are exclusively applied to finance or refinance in part or in full new existing eligible green projects. So it's like any other debt or fixed income security, except the proceeds that you get from such a bond are exclusively used for what we call eligible green projects. And obviously someone will be asking, what are these eligible green projects? We have some international frameworks, especially the green bond principles that have been developed by the International Capital Market Association, ICMA, that provides a framework that outlines what are eligible green project categories. And what you see on the screen are some of the categories that you classically find as eligible project categories. So pollution, prevention, sustainable management of living natural resources, and the list goes on, clean transportation. From a local perspective, as a country, besides just this framework that is established by ICMA, you could also look at the existing green growth strategies like the NBSUB, the National Climate Change Policy and Implementation Plan, and some of those strategies that are there can actually give you guidance in terms of the national priorities on what we could actually deploy proceeds of a bond towards. And then if you're actually looking at what are eligible green categories from an SDG perspective, I think the 6 that you see on the screen are some of the classical ones, like clean water and sanitation, energy, sustainable cities and communities, climate action, life below water, and the like. So again, you can actually look at it from this angle, that you could actually deploy the proceeds of a green bond towards interventions on these SDGs. One other issue that I think always pops up is who else is doing this? I think in our outreach program so far since we started this journey, when we actually interface with policymakers and the like, people always ask, who else is doing this? And so from an African perspective, what we've shown you is basically some of the movements that we've seen, the likes of Morocco, Nigeria, Seychelles. Seychelles, though it was actually called a blue bond, given the maritime nature of Seychelles, but it's still a green bond. Namibia, and then South Africa has also been in the market. And then quite recently, I think the newbie on this front is Kenya. I think they issued about 40 million for sustainable housing for student accommodation. So cumulatively, as of December last year, Africa was about 2.7 billion in terms of green bonds. So we certainly are looking forward for Zambia to join the ranks, of some of the entities that have come on board so far. I think my last slide, so far, we've looked at some of the barriers to developing green bond markets across different regimes. And we are trying to kind of work backwards, acknowledging that these are some of the issues that we're actually going to face. And so you see that some of the barriers that we see on the market is issues of lack of awareness, lack of green bond guidelines and listing rules, issues of costs and the like. And so the ones that have ticked in green are some of the milestones that we have so far achieved, not fully. The issue of awareness, I think part of the reason why we're actually having this webinar is also to increase awareness about about green bonds. And then the lack of green bond guidelines and listing rules, I'm happy to indicate that I think we've ticked that. My colleague, I think from Securities and Exchange Commission will speak to that quite at length. The cost of meeting green bonds, guidelines or issuing, processes, I think we are already working on that, trying to see how we can incentivize issuers and also the investors. So the ones that I've put in X it's still work in progress, but we do acknowledge that these are some of the issues that we're actually going to face, and we have a roadmap on how we're going to manage some of these, potential barriers to this process. So I think, Austin, for now, I would end there. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot, Bruno, for that presentation. So I think just a quick recap. I think Bruno just kind of ran us through, I guess, a brief history of the green bond space in general. Touched on what actually makes a green bond, and also spoke some of the experiences in other countries. As we can see, some of our colleagues like Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya are already, already active in this space. So Bruno, I think we'd like to hand over now to our next speaker, who's Mwila. I introduce Mwila from Stanbic. So Mwila, I think when you're ready, please, you can just give us your perspective as a market participant on this, on the topic of green bonds and climate investing.
Thank you, Austin, and thank you, Bruno, for that rundown. I suppose from where I'm sitting from, which is more of a commercial viewpoint, saying that I would tend to act as not the issuer, but the arranger or advisor on any entity that wants to issue green bonds. So to just kind of remove some of the mystery around what this would entail in terms of who's able to list and what products are out there. First and foremost, just to reiterate what Bruno said, green bonds are generally sustainable instruments, right? That are issued to basically finance sustainable projects or projects that meet certain international guidelines for green bonds and so on. Ultimately, apart from the use of proceeds, they can by and large be viewed as vanilla bond products. So in other ways, they can either be senior secured bonds, they can be asset-backed securities, or even sukuk bonds. So the use of proceeds is what actually defines the bond as green or a sustainable instrument. From a sort of regulatory perspective, I think we have seen, I mean, we've got Capital Markets Association of Zambia, we've seen the International Capital Markets Association come in and provide guidance and principles on how these bonds would look like and so forth. But beyond the bond aspects, there are other instruments that are kind of green and can serve different issuers. So for instance, you've got sustainable linked funding, which is usually funded through banks and a few sort of institutional investors can participate. But this would usually come in as either preference shares, term loans, or revolving capital facilities. So revolving capital facility will basically mirror a working capital facility, except that it goes on and on for a tenor of longer than 1 year. So what we've seen this come through from the loan market. And then you have a second category, which is sustainable loans. Now, sustainable loans will normally again be done through the bank market. They're usually term loans for capex funding and so on. The basic difference is usually they're bilaterals, and usually the bank will use pockets of financing that has been designated for sustainable projects. And then the last category, which is green, social or sustainable bonds, GSS bonds, which is the topic we're talking about right now. Normally the participants in that would be institutional investors and particular fund entities that have earmarked funds for green bonds or for sustainable development. Now, from a market perspective, I mean, Bruno has mentioned some of the pros and cons and difficulties, but there are a lot of market advantages to issuing a green paper or issuing green instruments. Firstly, chances are you can get tighter pricing, meaning your pricing can be less than your average market price. So that's always a positive. We have seen longer tenors in the green market. So for issuers who are doing project finance and need 15 to 20 years issuances, that's the kind of time frame that you easily see in the sustainable or GSS market. Also, there's a broadening of the investor base in that most issuances will not tick the box for a lot of green investors. But if you add in the green investors, chances are it will tick the box for non-green investors as well. So you kind of broaden your investor base. And there's a lot of money chasing these green investments. That what we have seen on the continent is that almost each and every green issuance has actually been oversubscribed, which then also leads back to my first point of tightening the pricing that you shall issue on. Thirdly, there's a reputational aspect. With where the world is going right now and information flowing quite quickly, customers base their purchasing or dealing decisions based on the reputation of the entity that they're dealing with. And so we have seen that issuing green gives the entity a good reputation, and that kind of flows into some of the ability to attract certain customers and so on. Tax incentives are also another thing that I'll also touch on later as we start the discussion part. In certain jurisdictions, you find that, say, withholding taxes is exempt on issuers that have issued green bonds, and so that adds to the price tightening of the issuer itself. So with those tax incentives and those advantages. There's a myriad of reasons why an entity would then aim to issue green. As with every instrument, there's advantages and disadvantages. I suppose some of the disadvantages, and Bruno has touched on a lot of this, come in with the administrative aspect. You need to get your bond certified green, first of all, and this has to be done on an annual basis, not just on issuance, but every year you need it certified. So the investors who are invested already have comfort that that investment through a 10, 15 or 20-year period remains green for each and every year. This can be costly, and administratively it can be taxing. And so the pros and the cons have to be weighed off against each other. And we have to get to a point where as a country, even as a continent to a larger extent, we have to be able to issue these instruments on a profitable, marketable perspective. And I suppose that's what we're going to be talking about later. And as the regulator comes in as well, that's going to be an important consideration to put forth. So beyond that, I suppose my view is the market ready? Only one way to find out is to test that. And one of the ways to test that will probably be to come up as we delve into the discussion aspect of this conversation. Thank you. Back to you, Austin.
Thanks, Mwila. Thanks for that. That's a very interesting perspective. I appreciate your comments. So I guess Mwila is saying basically, I mean, for us, if we are going to issue a green bond, right? Or if we're going to learn our lessons, the best way is to start. I think there's a couple of lessons that we have to learn. There's a couple of challenges we might have to face, but the issue that we need to get started. There's definitely an interest, as Mwila has shared, in people investing who want to invest into green bonds, or I guess social funds. So yeah, thanks for that. So we'll then move on to, I think, our final opening remarks from Mutumboi. But maybe I just make a quick request to the host, maybe just to, I think, just continue to mute other users so that we only have Mutumboi on the screen, or the speaker on the screen at any time. And please, just for the rest of for the audience, please be sure just to mute your mic. Just check that your mic is muted so we can actually have a presentation that's seamless and as few interruptions as possible. So Mutumboi, are you ready? Happy for you to take us on now.
Okay, Austin, thank you very much. May I please request Bruno to give me access to share my presentation?
So you can see your presentation now, Mutumboi, I think. So,
Sorry, I just had a bit of a technical issue with feedback. I was just sorting that. Are we good to, I think I still have Bruno that's holding on to the host. Can I please have the host?
It's actually Nicholas. It's Nicholas.
Can Nicholas just share the host with Mutumboi so she can run a presentation? Or maybe, unless maybe you can just, like, Nick can just run the slides for you. So you can just get started. I don't know if you see them. Mutumboi.
I think she just dropped out, yeah? Oh, she's there.
I can't see, oh, is Nicholas, are you able to please just put the full screen so we can go through it easily without the side views, so you can put full view?
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be part of this discussion. And I thought it'd be important for me to start from the point of, can you hear me? I missed the seconds. Sorry, I was just being told that I'm dropping on the other end. Is this any better? Can I have Mwanga's computer then? Let me use this laptop. My apologies. I am having network challenges for one reason or the other. Cannot worry.
You good?
Yeah. Okay, so
I guess while everyone is while Mutumboi is getting set up, I can see that some people have been posting issue in the chat. So please do feel free to go ahead and post your questions. We'll be looking at them later on in the Q&A session. Mutumboi, are you okay now?
Austin, maybe while it's just getting set up, maybe some of the questions could be answered.
That can certify a loan as an eligible green project, and that's kind of the level we'll need to reach at from a country perspective, whereas we can have agents in country that can, in lieu of having an entity come from England or the States to come and certify a project green, we have agents who work in tandem with those international entities to certify projects in Zambia and then get them certified as green. That way the projects can then be marketable. I think that will come a long way into reducing the cost, especially in modern times where travel is restricted and so on and so forth. You can't have someone coming into Zambia and going to the northwestern province to certify a project. So we need to kind of look internally and try to see how we can then create sustainable entities that can verify, whether it's private entities, whether it's through Zema, whether it's through, you know, Bruno's sort of team and so on. But we just need to localize this. That way we can then make it cheaper for issuers in Zambia to have their project certified green, not only at the beginning, but also the constant certification that needs to take place on an annual basis through the lifetime of the bond.
No, thanks, Mwila.
Yeah.
Bruno, maybe you have some comments around.
Yeah, Austin, may I just? Yeah,
no, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to add on with what Mwila has said, I think one of the critical issues to do when you're actually just beginning to issue is to develop a green bond framework. Now, this is a very critical aspect to any green bond issuance, because that is where you are actually going to specify some of the aspects that are very critical to a green bond when compared to other, just plain vanilla bonds. So the GBP, which is the green bond principles, do outline 4 critical components, one of which is specifying what are you going to use the proceeds for, and then the process for project evaluation and selection, then the management of proceeds, and also how are you going to do this periodic reporting, which is quite critical for green bonds. So once you've developed that green bond framework, I think we also indicated the fact that you can actually take a combination or just single form of verification, whether it's what is called a consultant review, a verification, certification, rating, or a second party opinion. So some of the issuers do a combination of those, or you can actually do just one, either a second party opinion. So that's quite critical. And then I think the other aspect I wanted to react to is the issue of having local verifiers. I think in the long run, it's a good thing to do that. But at the moment, you need to just be aware of the fact that if you go doing a road show, what you don't want is people start Googling who did the verification. It instills confidence when a verifier is somebody, whether an individual or a legal persona, that is quite well known in the international market. Because remember, you'll not just be selling these locally, you probably go to the London Stock Exchange, and you want to make sure that the person who put a stamp on the greenness of your framework is someone who will not have to be Googled, because that can actually dampen how the uptake of that instrument. Thank you.
Yeah, Bruno, I agree with you totally. I mean, it's very, very important to have a well-known entity, and that's why I mentioned affiliations. I think what we then need to work on is to get entities in Zambia affiliated with international entities that certify bonds. That way, you don't just put a name of, you know, Mwenya and Company certified this bond, but you put a name like Mwenya and Company, an affiliate of a well-known entity, certified this bond. I think in a sort of a global world that we're living in now, that has become extremely important. I think, and law firms, I think, have done that very, very well, where you see a lot of law firms in Zambia affiliated with international law firms. That way they get credibility. Should they provide an opinion, for instance, on a cross-border legal transaction, no one will have to question and say, why is a Zambian entity providing a cross-border legal opinion for a Zambian entity who wants to say expand to Mauritius? But if they're affiliated with a well-known international law firm, it then immediately ticks off that box because both their letterheads are on the document. So that's the kind of probably direction and position we need to go in, and specifically for Zambia, whereas interest costs are high, and so the cost of issuing debt, whether privately placed, whether bond or whether bank debt, tends to be quite prohibitive. And so you need to find every avenue you can to reduce the cost to the ultimate issuer.
No, thanks for that, Milan. Thanks for that, Bruno, as well, right? So I guess building off this conversation, I'll refer back to Mutumboi. Right, so Mutumboi, you kind of run us through the green bond framework in Zambia also contains certain guidelines to guide potential issuers on what is considered a green bond. I think maybe I would like for you just very simply put. So if I'm a Zambian issuer, right? Yeah. What are the quick checks I can look at to know that my bond is green or my project is green? And also, does our local standards, how do they align with other more internationally recognized standards?
Yeah. Thank you for that. And maybe before I go into answering that, I just wanted to also reiterate the previous speaker's point on localizing capacity. I mentioned earlier that the frameworks have been put in place through the efforts of, can you hear me?
Mutumboi, I think you might have to repeat yourself. So that, like, you broke off a little bit there. So I think you just start from the beginning.
Okay, so I was just making the point that the agenda of localizing capacity in terms of offering assessments and verification is something that we're pursuing frantically. And the thought process is to build capacity with local institutions as well, such as the Zambia, the Zika, and a few other bodies that focus on sustainability and climate change issues. So in coming back to what it is that an issuer would be having to focus on, I think Pascal put it into perspective that firstly, as an issuer, you need to determine who you are targeting to participate in this green project. And there are a number of guidelines that have been set out or standards that you can benchmark yourselves against. So for example, and I keep going back to ICMA, the International Capital Markets Association guidelines, because of they are internationally recognized. So you would have to structure your projects to align it with the green bonds principles, where you provide the disclosure on what the use of these proceeds are going to be, and you provide the disclosure in terms of how you're ring fencing, because that's another important principle of ICMA guidelines. And again, you need to also provide further information in terms of what your strategy is, and basically, you are needing to convince the would-be issuer that you have ticked off the boxes. So our guidelines has been couched in such a way that it's inclusive, and we are allowing you to, for example, I think Pascal mentioned that at his institutional level, they can verify or offer some grading or criteria. So if perhaps you are targeting local investors, and you came to us with the criteria that has been set by, say, Standard Bank for green bonds, if we look at it and are confident that it meets the purposes for determining authenticity and the disclosures that we require, we would allow you to go ahead and issue this green bond based on those standards. So we've couched our guidelines in a very broad way, so that we're also not restricting you or restricting issuers to just specific standards that are already established, although it's in your interest if the target is to attract international investors, for example.
Okay, no, thanks, Mutumboi. So if I got you correctly, what you're saying is our guidelines are flexible enough that you can choose the most appropriate certification or verification process. Of course, it has to align with an accepted standard, and use it for your specific issuance, right? Fantastic. So I think we have an idea of what makes a bond green. I don't know, Bruno, is this something that you want to touch on here?
Not really. I think I did outline earlier that besides the fact that we've got these international frameworks that are outlined by ICMA, and the fact that there will be these certifications, the likes of Cicero give you what they call the shades of green, dark green, light green, middle green. So that gives you a stamp on how green is your projects. But like I indicated, I think we want to make sure that the projects that we pick on actually emanate from some of the strategies that we've got. We have quite a number of green growth strategies that we've developed at great length, great inputs. I talked about the National Climate Change Policy and Implementation Plan, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. So we have enough fertile ground to pick up some of the key strategic areas that actually do qualify, for as green categories. But then that speaks to our national priorities. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thanks. So maybe asking also maybe very simply on the same
Austin,
point.
Can I?
Yeah, sure, Mutumboi,
Austin, can I just also mention that the guidelines, which are actually accessible from our website, include an appendix that gives examples of projects that are considered green projects. It would be a good reference point for the viewers to have a look at that in terms of being guided as well.
So this is available on the SEC website, the SEC website?
Yes.
Fantastic. Look, I think that's important just in case there's someone out there thinking that if they want to paint the warehouse green, they can issue a green bond. All right. So anyway, look, so I think based on our conversation. Mutumboi, sorry, your line was freezing there for a bit. So this is available on the SEC website, right? I think we'll just post the website within the chat. I'll ask our team just to post a link in the website, right? So I think we've touched on an issue here. So I think we are comfortable that if we're an issuer, there's a guidance available on what qualifies as green, right? I think the process is not very different from issuing a bond. The biggest issue or the biggest difference that we've uncovered in our conversation so far is that you need certification of the bond to ascertain that it's green, right? So I guess my next question then goes to Bruno. We've mentioned that the recognized certification authorities or bodies are mainly international, bodies. And I know that BIOFIN has been doing quite a bit of work in terms of not only the development of the framework, but also some engagement in building capacity in local market, right? So I think, Bruno, I'd like for you to touch on your experience in terms of activities towards building capacity, and also your thoughts on what you think we can do so we can start building that capacity locally so that we can then become, veterans at issuing these kinds of bonds.
All right, yeah. So I think we've again, under the able leadership, I think, of the Department of Climate Change and Natural Resources, and with a number of other, stakeholders, we've been able to actually have a number of, sessions with different, market players, to just try and provide capacity on green bond, processes. What are green bonds and what's the process that you need to go through? And I think it's been quite an exciting and very inclusive process. And we're also privileged to fly in, if you like, some of the notable players, I think, in this market, some of the second party opinion providers, the likes of Cicero, UNEP-FI, CBI themselves. So we've actually brought them into Zambia to try and provide capacity to the market players. I think going forward, what we need to see much more is some kind of hand-holding. So for those institutions that are really interested to issue, green bonds, we probably might be looking at hand-holding kind of, technical assistance. And we have a few packages, that are on the way to try and hand-hold such potential issuers, so that we provide capacity in relation to very specific projects as opposed to generic approach that we currently are doing. So it will be a mix of hand-holding and also some kind of generic, technical assistance. So we're still trying to mobilize resources to provide much more technical assistance, but I think we have something already going, and I can indicate at this point we're really looking forward to that first maiden, green bond issuance, and I think the market is ready to provide that, technical assistance. Yeah.
No, thanks, Bruno. And I guess maybe I could get a response from Mwila on this one. As a market participant, I think you've kind of already touched on the issue of, I forgot what you termed it, but where you have some sort of affiliation, yes, with the recognized body. Outside that, right? And based on Bruno's response to building capacity, in your opinion, what do you think we need to also do to ensure that we also start internalizing this knowledge and also these skills?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of there's a lot that still needs to be done, but let's not get too daunted by what's in front of us. I think we've done quite a bit as it is. First and foremost, we need to see where it's going to start from. Where is it? Is it going to be arrangers such as ourselves going up front and finding pockets of capital and then offering it to potential issuers, or will potential issuers themselves feel that there's a need, and then once they have that need, the arrangers start coming through? I think it's a bit of both. So forums such as this one is key, where you have arrangers, you've got technical experts, and you've got the regulators playing a part. This becomes key because you kind of need all those entities moving in tandem to get it done. If you look at the continent, and Bruno, correct me if I'm wrong, probably in Africa, there's been maybe 10 or just a little bit over that in terms of green bond issuances. So we're not that far behind. There've been very few, and even the countries that have issued a lot, that are leading in terms of issuances, whether it's Nigeria, I think there's 2 or 3. You have Kenya issuing its first one. South Africa has issued a couple as well. So we're not that far behind, and once we get past the theoretical and actually practically do it, it then becomes easier. The thing about arranging debt or arranging transactions in any sphere is that it's a lot like riding a bike. You can read about it all you want, but up until you actually get on a bike and ride it, that's when you know what challenges you have as an entity or as an individual. But once you do it, you get better at it. So it's key that we get past the first hurdle. Another thing that we probably need to do is start lobbying to create a market from the investor perspective. I mean, investors ultimately chase yield, right? So it's not just about them being benevolent, they also chase yield. So we then need to start looking at things like tax incentives. Are there tax incentives for an investor who invests in green bonds, like withholding tax, for instance? Do we create that framework? Beyond that, do we start looking internally before we look externally? If you look at, I think the case study that Bruno mentioned of the Kenya issuance, over 60% of it was subscribed by local Kenya-based funds. So we should also think of doing the same. If an issuance happens in Zambia, it should be front-run by locally based funds as opposed to international funds. International funds are good to get, and we'd hope that we'd get there at some point. But what needs to front-run that are the locally based funds. So we then ask ourselves, SEC is doing a lot of work around this. Is PIA doing any work around this as well? Are they carving out in the investment guidelines that they have? Are they carving out sections of those funds, for green bonds, for instance? If you look at investment guidelines that we have in Zambia for the PIA, for instance, they're very specific. How much you can put into property, what percentage you can put into equity, what percentage you can put in corporate bonds, and so on and so forth. But what if there's a carve out and that says that every fund needs to put at least 5% of the fund value into green funds? Then immediately you create a market, because you have the cash chasing the projects, which is what we're seeing globally. The cash is there, it's chasing the projects. And that's why every green issuance is oversubscribed. So, well, at least most of them. So those are the kind of subtle changes that we need to make. And just to front run, and one of the questions that I saw from Mr. Mulendema Thuridzai, I mean, he asked about USD issuances and how do you negate the FX risk. The fact is, the easiest way to negate FX risk is to have what we call, to avoid wrong way risk, meaning if you earn dollars, then borrow in dollars. But generally you borrow in the currency that you earn. The minute you start borrowing, creating wrong way risk, that's a danger that is very, very expensive to negate. So that's why I'm speaking, I'm sort of focusing on local institutional investors, because you would expect that the entities that will issue bonds in Zambia would want to issue in kwacha, because very few entities in Zambia generate USD or FX. So the easiest place to get kwacha would be the local pension funds. And so we need to create the framework that just moves not only from the capital market perspective, but also gets into the pension fund industry and regulates that aspect. So that's the easiest way to negate FX risk. So, I mean, he mentions classic case of Eurobonds. Again, the easiest way to do that is to borrow in local currency. If you look at a couple of case studies, and Bruno probably has this that you can share. I'm looking at it from a perspective of the case studies that I've seen that my entity, Standard Bank, has participated in. Just about all of them are actually local currency issuances. Whether it's in Nigeria, it's in Kenya, or it's in South Africa, they've all been local currency issuances, simply because the world and entities around the world have begun to recognize that FX risk is very, very difficult to get around if you don't hedge it naturally. That is, earn dollars, borrow in dollars. Minus that kind of natural hedge, it becomes very expensive and very difficult to hedge, especially on a long-term aspect. If you're borrowing for 10, 15, or 20 years, that's a very, very difficult period to hedge against. Thank you.
No, thanks, Mila. So you raised a very interesting point there, and thanks for also picking up Sarah Zai's question. I was actually going to come back to that. So you raised a very interesting point there around currently local investors putting a premium on returns above most considerations. So I'd like for us to come back to that. But before we do, what I'd like to do is just maybe go through some of the questions that are maybe relevant to what we've discussed so far, and just get some quick responses from our panelists. So I think there's a question from Moses Nasiska. I think it was directed at Bruno. I think he might have touched on this a little bit. The question is, what capacity do you offer for institutions interested in assisting players to issue green bonds, right? I don't know if Bruno, if you're happy with the remarks.
Well, I think in a way I provided kind of an umbrella answer to that. Like I indicated, we still journeying through to try and mobilize more resources to provide much more technical assistance, but we're quite hopeful given the appetite across the sector and different players that most likely the first 2-3 issues will probably not pay that much. So there's actually a bit of a sweetener if you'll be one of the first issues. Most likely there might be some very good technical assistance in developing the green bond framework and probably also to have it verified, certified and things like that. So yeah, it's not yet well defined, but all I can say is that we have a sense of the kind of technical assistance package that we can provide. Of course, I think UNDP, given its guidelines, will probably not participate in the actual commercial sense, especially when you do the issuances, your road shows and the like. But I think in the green aspects of that, helping you develop the framework to make sure that it passes the green litmus test. So there, certainly, I think we can try and provide technical assistance in that realm. Thank you.
No, thanks, Bruno. So I'm guessing from Moses's question, and I guess maybe it's something just for you, I guess, to take note of and to consider, is that the market is hungry to, at least from the capital market players, the intermediaries, very interested in knowing how they can assist potential issuers. So they can possibly become your evangelists, trying to convince potential issuers, right? And then this one might go to Mutumboi. I think it spoke to the question I asked earlier. The question is from Noah Siachoto, right? He's asking, what specific aquaculture and agricultural green projects currently being implemented that smallholder farmers would benefit more directly? I'm not sure I understand the question, but I will take a stab at trying to decipher it. In that, maybe asking, does aquaculture and agriculture green projects qualify for green financing for issuing a green bond? Maybe Mutumboi and Bruno, I don't know, any quick comments on that?
Sorry, I think actually the Director of Climate Change, Mr. Stima, is here. He probably would actually touch on that because he has a good understanding of what's going on. So maybe at some point you probably might just bring him in to try and help to answer that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sure. I think yes, definitely we have him on the call. I think Nick, just maybe you can just activate his mic. So we have Mr. Ephraim, the Director of Climate Change and Natural Resources. I think he can maybe make a quick comment on that specific issue.
Thank you very much, moderator. I hope I can be heard. It's not very easy to just categorically say all agricultural projects or aquaculture would qualify as green projects. There are a lot of things that you have to look at, both what approach you are taking in the agriculture, for example, because we know that agriculture, when it comes to climate change, if not well done, is one of the major sources of emissions, and therefore you cannot just with a blanket say this is a green project. So it depends on what approach you are undertaking. The same applies to aquaculture. So I think the devil is in the details in terms of the projects that qualify for as green bonds. But moderator, maybe while I'm on the floor, just quickly, it's just to indicate our excitement as a ministry and the department that hosts the BIOFIN with the progress that we've made so far, and also the partnerships that Bruno and the team has managed to forge. Also to commend the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, that we are even talking of the guidelines that has already been prepared. For us, this is very exciting. And like Bruno indicated, the resources that are required to address climate action, biodiversity conservation, is way beyond what the public can offer. But globally, the public finance is not adequate. And so we have to look at these innovative funding sources. And the green bond is one low-hanging fruit that we think also provides an opportunity for the private sector and business in general to participate in the conservation of biological diversity, climate action, and also restoration of wetlands. On the policy front, maybe just to share that we are going beyond just the climate policy we have and the biodiversity strategy that Bruno referred to. Right now, we are just in the middle of formulating a climate change bill, which is focusing on these market mechanisms. So the policy environment is getting better. I can only encourage participants to ensure that we can move beyond maybe talking. I liked what, is it Mwila indicated that unless you can try to ride your bike, you will not tell whether you succeed or not. So even on the green bond, the quicker we can have an institution actually being bold enough and take up the steps, like Bruno indicated, support will be extended to that institution because it will be a demonstration that we can actually do it. So thank you.
No, thank you very much for that contribution. It's actually very, very insightful and very helpful. I think it gives some sort of hope to participants that the policy, national policy, also is aligning to the green ambitions, and that is taking into account green bonds as an important means of financing green projects. So that's actually thanks for that contribution. I think that's actually very, very helpful. Then maybe I'll take one more question before I go back. Mutumboi, you want to say something?
Yes, I did want to say something back to Noah.
Sure.
And thank you for that input from the director there. I think the approach and what we want to encourage the public to do is to take this challenge as theirs as well, and to think outside the box in terms of how they themselves can design and foster the agenda of sustainability. So the point is not to really wait for somebody to champion a green project, but in your space, are you able to frame a green project that is aligned to the broader objective? I was just perusing the 7th National Development Plan. I'm not sure how many of us have done that. And you will see in there that there are a number of green projects that have been envisioned by the country. And one such project is productivity enhancing technology development. So in there, the output that is foreseen is climate smart agriculture technologies and practices developed and disseminated. So we have this aspiration, and as I said earlier, our national plan is a very good plan in the sense that it embodied the SDGs and aspires to attain, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals as we are achieving our National Development Agenda. But it takes we the Zambians to make reference to these documents, to make reference to the framework, and design these products that will mobilize the resources required for us to achieve sustainability as a nation.
All right, thanks, Mutumboi. Thanks, Mutumboi. All right, so maybe I'll just take one more question, I think, from the chat before I then proceed again to our discussion. Right, so we have a question from Thomas. It's targeted at both Bruno and Mutumboi. Right, I think he might have touched on this a little bit. But I think he cites a specific example. He says he had an opportunity sitting on one of the boards of one of our big mines in Zambia, right? And they were trying to deal with an issue of environmental degradation, and formed a special purpose vehicle, I guess, to raise the financing for this project. But it was poorly financed, right? And he thinks that green bonds would have been a good source of funding. So his question is, have we engaged the mines? And I guess maybe the broader question is, maybe who in the sector have we engaged with?
Okay. I think initially our constituents, if you like, was to look at the key government departments that basically superintend over green growth. So you have your forest department, fisheries and the like. But beyond just government, then we had to go to the financial sector. So you have your Bank of Zambia and its subsidiaries, the banks themselves and non-banking financial institutions. We had, of course, capital markets. players. And also, I think some of the entities under the pensions and insurance, though I must indicate that I think there's still quite a huge gap in our liaison with the PIA, because I think that's something that has been echoed. These guys actually have quite a huge chunk of funds that would actually benefit, this process. With the mines, very specific, I think we wouldn't say we've reached to them bilaterally, but I think that's the next step. We're trying to develop a communication strategy, I think, with SEC to try and see which entities do we need to kind of engage bilaterally. Remember what I mentioned, the hand-holding. I think we are at that point where those institutions that we think are best positions to issue the maiden, bonds, then we can target that tier support to those, so that we kind of avoid this generic wholesale tier support. So it's good that has been mentioned. We probably might, I think, look into that. But I think one thing I also just wanted to mention is that, yeah, it's one thing to have interest, but then we need to look at also the transaction costs and the economies of scale issue. So, certain bond ticket sizes might actually not fly. So I'm sure Mwila would be able to speak to that. So given the costs, I think the ticket size must actually be big enough to consume those costs, so that then we play around with the economies of scale. So I think someone was saying, is it possible to, band together, form a consortium? Yeah, because when you develop a green bond framework, it actually can speak to different, categories of those eligible green categories. So yeah, I think to make sure that we have the large enough ticket size, we probably would be looking at something like that, where, different institutions, can come together for a common, cause and issue one bond, so that the size is good enough. Thank you.
No, thanks, Bruno. No, thanks for addressing Shtangala Nahum's question around whether an issue can be made by syndication, right? So where more than one issuer come together, or at least a financier come together and then issue a bond, which with maybe multiple participants are benefiting from the proceeds of the bond, right? So we're actually close to running out of time. So I guess we should kind of rush through this quickly. I would like, there's a point that I think that that Mwila touched on, that I would like to kind of go back to real quick. But I think this is quite important, right? And I think it's the issue, and I think it's the issue of our local markets being primarily return driven, right? So most Zambians will ask you, okay, what's the cost, right? So if I'm looking at investing, and we're now speaking from the investor perspective, what's in it for the investor, right? And what do we need to do to make it worth the investors' while? So maybe Mwila, I guess I can kind of take you back. Maybe you can kind of speak to that, and then I'd like Bruno to kind of touch on that quickly as well.
Well, look, are they primarily return driven? The answer would be yes, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's acceptable. So what then needs to happen is, first and foremost, we need to have various financially measurable motivators to get them across. The first one that comes to mind, I mentioned tax, right? If you make the instruments, for instance, zero tax rated with regards to withholding tax, that is a big step in one direction. But also, if you remove the return aspect and have it legalized to a certain extent, that their portfolios need to have a certain amount of green or socially sustainable investments as part of their portfolios, whether it's 5%, 10%. If this is a need, then that part of the portfolio does not necessarily have to compete with returns on other aspects of their portfolio, which are purely commercial driven. So those are kind of the motivation factor. So in there, you've got two motivation factors. One, you've got an incentive, and on the other side, you've got a legislative motivation factor, whereas you legislate the percentage of the portfolios that are designated green. That is a start. That is a start. And out there, when you leave, I suppose, the borders in Zambia and go further, you will find that there are other entities that seemingly are benevolent investors who specifically want to invest in green in green projects. But when you go beyond the first veil and look beyond, you find that even they probably have funds from entities that have designated part of their portfolio for green. So it goes on and on and on. So the motivating factors are many. It could be tax driven, it could be legislative driven. All those need to come together to motivate the investors to invest. As much as they are ultimately, well, they're primarily return driven, they're also driven by other things. Even they want to be seen as being good corporate citizens in the communities in which they exist. And remember, the money they have as investors, pension funds and so on, are money from people who live in those communities. So it's important that they also realize this. And so if an avenue is created for them to invest, then they will invest, I believe.
Yeah, and I think just to just touch on a few specifics related to what Mwila has indicated. We've actually looked through what are some of the transaction costs that we think a potential issuer is likely to incur. And I'm happy to indicate that we are actually already working on some of those. If not that, we've already worked on them, except I think probably it's a bit too early for us to bring out the details. But I think probably tomorrow would speak to what we've done on the SEC registration fees, scrutiny fees, annual issuers fees. And I think we're also working with Luce on issues of listing fees and scrutiny fees, just to try and incentivize issuer by way of reducing the transaction costs. We will be marching on to try and look at, on the fiscal part of it, lobbying with Ministry of Finance on having some kind of preferential withholding tax on green bonds. I know, like for our colleagues in Kenya, for them, they've actually zero-rated the withholding tax on green bonds. And that is what has actually happened in most of the jurisdictions. So it's something that we look forward when we engage Ministry of Finance to try and see if at all we can zero-rate the withholding tax on green bonds. Then there's also, in other jurisdictions, what we have actually seen to try and incentivize, especially the investors, is having income tax deduction on issuance costs for green bonds. So all those are some of the avenues that we'll probably pursue together with SEC in discussion with Ministry of Finance and ZRA, of course, given that they're a custodian of the fiscal side. So we've lined up some of these. So wish us luck that we don't hit a brick wall, but we're quite hopeful that we'll be able to bring down some of these costs and also to try and incentivize potential issuers on the fiscal side. Thank you.
Yeah. Austin, I can just come in there because I think it suffices to mention that on its part, the Commission has already gone ahead and has reduced the cost of registration for green bond issuers. So whereas on a traditional bond, you are required to pay 0.25% of the amount that is being issued. With the green bond, the Commission has reduced that to 0.1%. I'm not sure whether you got that.
Yeah, though there was a bit of noise, but maybe you can proceed.
Yes, so we were saying that on our part as a Commission, we've already made a lot of progress in that space to reduce the cost. And we can confirm that it is indeed on the action plan that we'll be meeting with Ministry of Finance. We've actually sounded it in initial meetings, but we need to formalize it and pushing for requests for incentives. But then I thought it would be important to mention that, beyond this, we need to be agreed that the issue of sustainability, the reason why it has to be a green bond is extremely noble and an urgent matter. You will recall I actually looked at the issue of climate change effects and termed it as systemic risk. It is how we are seeing it as a financial regulator. And we have seen how quickly systemic risk can materialize with the experience of COVID. It may be far-fetched right now, but I could use this example of COVID, that perhaps in January, if somebody was asking you to postpone your travel, you probably thought it was too far-fetched. It's the same issue with climate change. It looks like it's very far-fetched, but it's already upon us. And therefore my appeal is that the way we approach the agenda of sustainability and promotion of green bonds is with the realization that humanity's sustainability is actually anchored on these innovations, and for us to passionately pursue them.
Yeah, just one quick one, Austin. Sorry, just wanted to mention, also acknowledge, I think the point by Jasper Onyango, I think that's my brother from Kenya, that GrantCo and PIDG were quite instrumental in Kenya as part of just the de-risking process. So the point is taken, and I think we'll look into something like that as part of just the de-risking package to provide guarantees and the like to potential issues. So just to acknowledge that that's a point that is worth taking note, and we've actually seen, and we'll take note of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruno. And actually, unfortunately, we're actually out of time. So time does fly. So I'll be requesting for the team to just quickly wrap up with final comments. Bruno and Mutumboi just spoke, so maybe I'll ask Pascal to start off. Maybe his final remarks, especially on what his thoughts are. What's next for us? What should we focus on as a priority in terms of green bonds?
Yeah, thank you very much, Austin. I think firmly the focus should be on one, incentives to create the market for them. It's a sort of it's a walk. You have to have both the left leg and right leg moving together in tandem. So at this point, the focus should be to create the capital side, create the market for investors, and create the funding. If the money is there, the projects will come up as well, and they'll start chasing that money, because capital, entities are always looking for capital. That's a never-ending story, and it will never end. So as long as the capital is there, they will chase it down whatever alley their capital is. So if we create that avenue and that alley, then the projects will come through. And I suppose we have to work together, the regulators, institutions such as BIOFIN and where Bruno is, and then ultimately the arrangers such as ourselves. And we're always willing and open for business. We're happy to facilitate any other discussions and anything that would basically help create this market. As Mutumboi said, it's a very, very key thing to happen. The environment is something that we really cannot put on pause. We have to look at and pay attention to now. Thank you.
Thanks, Pascal. Well put. Mutumboi, your final quick remarks in a minute? Maybe Bruno, maybe you can.
Sorry, I'd muted my microphone. Sorry. My final quick remarks are simply that the capital markets are repositioning themselves as the enabler for economic growth, sustainable economic growth. They have showcased themselves in the past, and they have a reason to the call for climate change and environment benefits. And so the institution of this green bonds framework is a signal to the Zambian public that as the Securities and Exchange Commission, as one of the financial sector regulators, we are extremely passionate about playing our role in the agenda of sustainability. And we are very open to engaging with yourselves. And that's also for the gentleman who gave us a case study of a special purpose vehicle that has been set up. I would like to touch base with you and really understand what KCM was trying to do, and to see whether we can still work with that project.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mutumboi. And Bruno, last but not least, your final comments. What do you think is important for us to focus on next?
Well, to be honest, I think creating an enabling framework and environment for green bond, development requires some very good stakeholder cohesion. And I think we focused on that at first because, to be honest, it was very difficult to actually bring different players together. But I think thanks to everyone, especially the receptiveness.
Excuse me, Bruno. Hello?
Hello?
Yes, green bond.
Oh.
I think, Bruno, please continue.
Okay, yeah. So I know I just wanted to shout out to different stakeholders I think that we've worked with. Like I indicated, to start this conversation, it wasn't easy, but I think the receptiveness, astuteness of SEC, and also the guidance from our host ministry, the Minister of Lands, especially the Department of Climate Change, UNDP and BIOFIN Global, LUCE, the banking sector, and everybody else that we've been working with as part of the core group. It's been excellent. And I think we still have quite a long way to go. And I think we'll need this cohesion to continue. Especially, I think, as we march on to look at issues of incentives and towards the launch. Because what we actually didn't want is to launch something that is half-baked. We wanted to make sure that we have quite enough in terms of even incentives before we actually do the formal launch. So I can only call for more cohesion, and I can indicate that we are frantically trying to look for more TA support. And I think the ministry and of course the UNDP is helping to do that. So we can only encourage that, please bring those projects. Like I indicated, the first, most likely 2 or 3 might actually enjoy very good TA support. So bring those ideas. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Bruno. And I think maybe just to wrap up real quick, seeing as we come to the end of our discussion today. So I think we can see, so we've had, first of all, I think we've got on the regulation side, I think Mutumboi has expressed that, I mean, SEC is very happy and willing to make sure that they create an environment for the green bond market to grow. Mwila from the market is saying, look, the market is ready and hungry to try to issue this, they want to get started. And also from Bruno and who represents, foreign donor support, he says, look, there's a lot of support to get this going. So this is an issue of just us as a market or us as Zambians just taking this thing on. So I'd like to thank my panelists so much for the contributions. It's been a lively discussion. And I think very importantly, I think the participants, I think we've got 84 participants on this discussion, which I'm quite impressed with. And also quite impressed with the questions and contributions that we've made. Apologies for some of the technical glitches. I think it's something that we're getting used to with these virtual meetings, right? But I guess with time, as the CMAZ does more of these, I think we'll get better and better and better. So apologies for that. And just thank you so much for everyone. And thanks, and have a good day and stay safe, social distancing, don't touch your face and all that good stuff. Thanks and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello?